If the girl you've had a crush on since 7th grade is now a crack whore screwing down on the corner, or else she's at some liberal arts university in the process of being turned into a bitter man-hating feminist, and while you yourself couldn't beat the race and gender quotas or get a scholarship like girls can, and so you're stuck at home going to the local community college and delivering pizzas or working in the stockroom for some temp agency, if that's the case, then I can understand why such a white boy goes online when he gets home at night and becomes a warrior dwarf with magic powers who can kill ogres with balls of blue fire. And for the Jew, that's a hell of a lot preferable to having white boys trying to kill the real ogres. The white boy or man who never makes it out of adolescence is now a generally recognized figure of fun in popular culture. He's been around for a while. There was a song back in the 70s that had a line, "You know, my heart keeps telling me you're not a kid at 33. Then there are famous examples like Homer and the comic book guy on The Simpsons. And you remember the whole Star Trek, Star Wars fan phenomenon? Today the media poke fun at your typical Trekkie or Star Wars obsessive who still lives in his parents' basement at age 40 with his Spock ears, his plastic toy lightsaber, and his computer. Okay, that's a bit of an extreme example, but we all know that guys like that exist, and there's enough truth in that caricature to hurt. And, of course, there are other forms of immaturity than online and video games addiction, other forms of white refusal to grow up. Mostly white male refusal to grow up, although I know girls are susceptible to this too, just not, I think, to as great a degree. There's drinking and drugs and the endless sense of drift that many young white people have. One of the scariest things I think a parent or anybody can hear is when you ask some 16 or 17-year-old high school kid what his or her major is going to be in college, and they reply, I don't know, whatever. A 17-year-old young man or young woman with no purpose and no idea what they want to do with their lives is a sure sign that somebody has failed badly somewhere along the way. I'm sure all of us are familiar with the phenomenon of white kids getting married way too young, as the saying goes, and the marriage breaks up due to one or both spouses' inability to grow up, stop drinking, stop partying, stop blowing dope, stop screwing around, start working, and start getting serious about life, like it's one big Porky's movie. Usually it's the husband, true, but sometimes the wife is just as sleazy and immature, and sometimes there's a couple of kids involved by the time the divorce comes around, God help them. 50% of all marriages end in divorce, and since a lot fewer blacks bother to get married, Mexicans divorce very seldom, and Asians almost never, those casualty statistics are mostly white. This idea that, they got married too young is bullshit. They didn't get married too young, they just weren't old enough when they got married, if you get the subtle difference I'm referring to. White kids just plain don't grow up and become men and women fast enough. Now, why does this happen? What the hell caused such a phenomenon? I know this is going to sound very cliche, but like most cliches, it's actually true. The fact is that the United States has just come out of possibly the longest period of unbroken peace and certainly prosperity in history. It used to be you had the Army to worry about at age 18, but since 1972, that's no longer true. And much to my surprise, it looks like it won't be true for a while longer at least. Apparently, the mighty United States of America, land of the free and home of the brave, still doesn't have sufficient trust in the loyalty of its citizens so that they don't dare to conscript an army. With some exceptions among the remaining blue-collar class, white boys are never forced by necessity to grow up. A lot of them spend the first one-third of their lives going to school, 12 years of public or private school up to high school graduation, then comes 4 years to get a bachelor's degree, and then another 2 to 4 years to get a master's or some other specialist degree, and then maybe another 4 years to get a PhD in some cases, allowing for a miscellaneous year or two spent dicking around, backpacking around Europe, or snowboarding in Aspen, or more likely just delivering pizzas by night and sitting in the basement playing online games by day. And the average white boy is 27 or 28 years old before the pressure to get a real job and get out of his parents' house and actually become a man becomes really acute. And even then, a lot of times, these overgrown teenagers never really grow up. I mean, look at Bill Clinton. I've already told you guys the story about the techie nerds in their late 20s and 30s bringing their childhood toys to work in their cubicles, so I won't repeat that. But what is chilling is that every time I do tell that story, I get confirmations from a lot of you listeners who have seen the same thing in your own workplaces. You know, this long, drawn-out adolescence thing is a very recent development. Only in this luxurious world that America has created for the past century or so has it become the fashion to say that age 21 is adulthood. In the past, when the average lifespan was about 50, if you were lucky, our people have always had to grow up a lot quicker than that. In the pioneer days, a boy was pretty much a man at 16, and a girl was a woman even younger. In the Middle Ages, boys were apprenticed to a trade around the age of 7, and they became adult journeymen at 16 or so, depending on the trade. Girls were usually engaged by the age of 12 and married at age 13 or 14 in marriages arranged by their parents. Among the upper classes, it was not at all uncommon for men like Edward, the Black Prince of Wales, and Sigismondo Malatesta, the Lord of Rimini in Italy, to command armies at the age of 16 and win battles. In 1783, William Pitt the Younger became Prime Minister of Great Britain at the age of 24. Lucky for us, because Pitt was the prime minister who signed off on American independence. In our own Civil War, 19 and 20-year-old colonels on both sides were by no means unknown, and George Armstrong Custer made brigadier general in the Union Army at the age of 23, while William Paul Roberts of North Carolina also made general in the Confederate Army at the same age. The point I'm trying to make here is that maturity and preparation for adult life are not something biological. They're one of those things that's purely cultural and environmental, something that we can take control of and change if we create a new society in the Northwest Republic that understands the necessity to make responsibility a part of every young man and woman's upbringing. Now, there's something to be said for a young man simply being thrown into the deep end at age 16 or 17 and made to sink or swim. Me, I had no choice. My father threw me out of the house when I graduated high school at age 17, and I had no option but to volunteer for the Army. In many ways, I now believe that it's the best thing he could have done for me, although that certainly wasn't his intention. I have 2 brothers, both of whom towed the official line and applied the lips in the prescribed manner, both at home and in politically correct society, and who accordingly, all their lives, reaped all the benefits of wealth and the American lifestyle, which I did not. And today, I have to admit, I'm jealous of their medical insurance, but other than that, they don't have a damn thing I want. And judging how they turned out, I wouldn't trade places with either of them. I take my middle brother, for example, and no, I'm not just airing my family's dirty laundry here. I'm choosing him because this guy is actually, in some respects, a pretty good and typical example of a 21st century white male, whose life story demonstrates how we got into the mess we got into today. Now, my brother spent 10 years in college at God knows what kind of expense to the family. He may have gotten a few scholarships, or he may not have, I don't know. We haven't spoken for 21 years, and last time we did, he was screaming threats and abuse into the phone, so we really didn't have time to catch up on our respective backstories, so I admit there's some gaps here. Anyway, my brother spent 10 years in multiple universities in order to get a bachelor's and a master's degree in musical composition of all the god-awful useless things. According to his own online resume, he then failed to take his doctorate after 2 more years of quote-unquote postgraduate studies for whatever reason. Who knows, maybe my father finally got tired of footing the bills for a 30-year-old man who was by then pretty clearly never ever going to make his way in the world, although to be fair, he had other issues as well, which pretty much ensured that gainful employment was never on the cards for him. Those issues, by the way, were also largely attributable to growing up in a politically correct liberal democracy. Like I said, I'm not here to run down my brother. I'm simply using him because he's an example I'm familiar with. The simple fact is that, so far as I can determine, he's never worked a day in his life. By that, I don't mean tuning pianos or cutting firewood with a chainsaw for his Franklin stove. I mean, never in his life, again, so far as I can determine, has my brother been forced to hear that alarm go off in the morning, drag his ass out of bed, drive through horrible traffic to some place he doesn't really want to be, and for the next 8 hours do really stupid crap with stupid people, and then drive home through the traffic again and get up the next day and do it all over. Because if he didn't, he wouldn't be able to pay the rent on the first of the month, and he'd end up living in his car. Now, I have done that, and there's no doubt in my mind that I'm a better man for it. My younger brother played it a little bit smarter. When he couldn't cut it in New York, he came back to North Carolina and went to work for the state, which is basically North Carolina where you go if you can't cut it in the private sector. He put it on cruise control, and now he's presumably cruising down the home stretch to his pension. Unless, of course, the state of North Carolina goes bankrupt like so many other states do, thanks to the Democrats' subprime mortgage monkey shines leading to the present Democratic Depression. And neither of my brothers has had any children of their own. I've produced 5, maybe 6. Apparently, there is something about poverty that tends towards reproduction of the species, and something about middle-class affluence that reduces or stunts reproduction altogether, which is weird. You'd think the reverse would be the case, but apparently not, at least not in this country. My middle brother has produced some musical compositions, fair enough, so at least he'll leave something behind. My younger brother, so far as I can discern, won't leave jack shit behind. I've produced 16 books and probably millions of other written words, and if it wasn't for my children, the entire Covington line would have died out. Now, I attribute this, frankly, to the fact that I was cut loose at 17 and forced to fend for myself. The baby boom, my brother's generation and mine, simply hasn't reproduced itself because we're too corrupted with liberalism, capitalist luxury, buggery, feminism, and narcissism. We wallowed in luxury for almost 70 years, but that era is over now, and it's time to pay the piper. If we don't get our act together, the piper's fee may well be our racial extinction.